Go.
Start the timer. Hi everybody, this is Mrs. Salomon. We miss you all and hope you're doing well, hunkered down during this coronavirus outbreak. And I want to tell you a story. This is a story that we tell every year. Because despite the coronavirus, in a couple of weeks it will be Passover. Passover is a time when we commemorate the Jews leaving Egypt. But more than that, we commemorate the Jews becoming the Jewish people. This is sort of the story of how they became the Jewish people. So relax, and I'm going to tell you this story. Long time ago, thousands of years ago, and this story is in the Torah, in the book of Exodus, the Jews lived in Egypt. Now, how did they get to Egypt? Well, if you recall the story of Joseph, Joseph's brothers sold him into slavery, and Joseph became very, very prominent in Egypt. And Pharaoh trusted Joseph. So Joseph, when there was a famine, which means there wasn't enough food for people, he invited the Jewish people to come to Egypt to live. And for a long time, they did really, really well living in Egypt. They had a good life. And different pharaohs came, and hundreds of years passed. And a new pharaoh came about who didn't know Joseph and the story of Joseph and how important he was to the pharaoh. And he saw all these Jewish people and he said, you know what? There's a problem here. We've got too many Jews and they're becoming too numerous and they might try to take over. So he decided that what he was going to do to solve this problem was to make the Jews slaves. Now, what's a slave? If you were a slave, it would mean that you wouldn't get paid. You would have to work for somebody. You would be owned by somebody, like property. You would have to do what they say. You would not get much food. You would not get much rest. And you would have to do whatever the person that owns you told you to do. Pharaoh had all of these slaves build cities for him. And it was very hard work in the hot sun. As I said, they had very little food. And it was a very, very tough life. But Pharaoh finally said, you know what? There's still too many Jews. We have to do something about it. So he had a plan. He decided that he was going to, all the baby boys that were born, he was going to have them thrown into the River Nile. Because if there were no baby boys, then they wouldn't grow up to be daddies and there would be no more Jews. Well, obviously, Jewish mommies wouldn't want anything to happen to their babies. And there was one mommy, and her name was Yocheved. Yocheved had a baby boy, and she decided that she was going to hide him. So she hid him for a while, but it's very hard to hide a baby because babies make a lot of noise, and she was afraid that she would be caught. So she decided to do something. She decided she'd put the baby, she wrapped him up, and she put him in a basket, and she said to his older sister Miriam, watch, and I'm going to put him in the Nile River and see what happens to him. So she put the basket in the river. The basket with the baby floated down the river. And it so happens that the Pharaoh's daughter, the princess, was swimming in the Nile River, and she found the basket with the baby. Now, when she saw the baby, especially when she saw what he was wrapped in, she knew that this was probably a Jewish baby, that he was probably the baby of a slave. But she wanted very much to have a child of her own. So she took the baby to the palace, and she made the baby a prince. And he grew up, and his name was Moses, which means to be brought out from the water. Now, Moses grew up in the palace. Moses knew that he was Jewish. And he saw how the Jewish people suffered, how they were treated so terribly, and it really bothered him. So Moses decided that he couldn't stand it anymore. So what he did is he went in, when he grew up, he went into the desert and he became a shepherd. A shepherd is somebody that takes care of sheep. And actually he met a woman and he got married, and his father-in-law, whose name was Jethro, was having him take care of his sheep. And Moses was in the desert one day and he saw something very strange. He saw a bush. The bush was on fire, but the bush was not burning up. You know how we put logs in the fireplace and your parents set it on fire and it burns up into ash? Well, this bush was on fire, but it wasn't burning up. Moses was very curious, so he went closer. And he heard a voice. And the voice said to him, Moses, first of all, he said, take off your shoes because you're standing on holy ground. Holy means very special. You're in a very special place. And Moses did what God said. And God talked to him. He said, Moses, I need you to go back to Egypt and go to Pharaoh and tell Pharaoh to let your people go. Moses said, but I don't talk very well, and Pharaoh's not going to listen to me. And God said, I will send your brother Aaron with you to help you, and I will help you out. I will do things that will help you. So Moses listened to God, and he took his family and he went back to Egypt. And he went to Pharaoh, and he said to Pharaoh, I want you to let the Jewish people go. I don't want them to be slaves anymore. And Pharaoh wasn't going to give up all these slaves. They were doing all this work for him. So Pharaoh said, no, I'm not going to. And this is where God stepped in. God helped out by sending plagues. Plagues are bad things that happen. The first plague he sent was dam. Dam is Hebrew for blood. The water turned to blood, the water in the Nile River. Now they needed the water to swim in and to drink and to clean themselves. And it was pretty scary. But still, Pharaoh said no. Then he sent frogs. Not just a few frogs, thousands of frogs. They say that in the Torah it says that the frogs, there were so many of them that it got into the bread trough and was baked into the bread. Yuck. And these frogs were everywhere. Still, Pharaoh said, this is annoying, but no. And then he sent kinim. Kinim are lice. Now, I don't know if any of you have ever had lice before, but it really itches and it's really uncomfortable. Still, Pharaoh said no. God sent other plagues, like he sent cattle disease, where all of the cattle got sick. He sent boils, which are big, huge, pussy sores all over their bodies. Still, Pharaoh kept saying no. He sent darkness. He sent hail. Hail are big balls of ice. Still, he said no. Finally, the last plague he sent was called Machat Korim, which means the slaying of the firstborn. Now Pharaoh, God instructed the Jewish people that they should mark their doors so that the angel of death would pass over their houses. And all of the Egyptian firstborn sons got very sick and died. And Pharaoh had a son who died. And of course, any parent that would lose a child, that is a horrible thing. So finally Pharaoh said, this is enough. I'm going to let them go. And he called Moses and he said, yes, take your people and go. Now, the Jewish people knew they had to leave very quickly because Pharaoh might change his mind. So they got the little provisions that they had, and they took the bread that they didn't have time to let rise, and they put it on their back and it baked in the sun. And they left Egypt very, very quickly. And they got to the Reed Sea, to the sea. Now, there was a big ocean. They didn't have any boats. They had no way to get across the ocean, the sea. And they looked behind them, and lo and behold, Pharaoh was coming after them with his chariots to get them. He had changed his mind. And they didn't know what to do. And they pleaded with God to help them. So Moses lifted his staff, and lo and behold, the water parted. And they were able to walk across the water on dry land. And then the water closed after they got across, and the Egyptians were not able to get to them, and the Jews were safe. And it said that Miriam, Moses' sister, led them in song, in praising God. Now, they were free. Now, to be free is kind of a scary thing, because when you've been a slave, somebody always tells you what to do. They tell you when to get up, they tell you when you can eat, what to do. All of a sudden, they're free. And they had a problem. They had to decide what to do. They needed laws, they needed rules. There were a lot of them. And they had been slaves for over 400 years. That means their fathers had been slaves, their grandfathers, they didn't know anything else. So they decided to make Moses their leader, and Moses should lead them out of Egypt. Now, Moses did lead them. They wandered in the desert for 40 years before they came to the promised land, which God promised them, which is the land of Israel. And during that 40 years, when they were landing, they came to Mount Sinai. And God instructed Moses to go to the top of the mountain. And there he gave him 10 important rules. Those 10 rules are the 10 commandments that we know, things that we shouldn't do and things that we should do to be able to lead the best life. And Moses gave those rules to the people, and the people gave those rules to the Jewish people gave those rules to the world. And finally, after 40 years, the Jewish people came to the land that they were promised by God. Moses did not get there with them because God told Moses that he was going to die before he got to the promised land. And this is how we became the Jewish people, how we got to Israel. And every year we celebrate Passover in a special way. We don't just read the story. We experience the story through a Seder. Seder in Hebrew means order. We do things in a special order. We eat special foods that remind us. For example, we eat the parsley that reminds us that Passover takes place in the spring. We eat an egg that reminds us of life, because life comes from an egg and how important life is. We eat moror, bitter herb, and it's very bitter, and we go like this, and it makes us, for instance, feel what it feels like to be a slave, how bitter, how awful it is. We have salt water, which reminds us of the tears and the sweat that the Jews, when they were slaves, they cried and they sweat. We eat charoset, which is chopped up apples and nuts and wine, and we eat that to remind us of the mortar that the Jews used to make the bricks for Pharaoh. So all of this is a special way that we remember the story of Passover. But most importantly, we eat matzah. Matzah is the flat bread. And for 7 days, we are commanded that we should not eat chametz. Chametz is bread that rises. We should only eat matzah to remind us what it's like. That's the bread of slavery, and that's what we eat. So during this Passover, when you sit at the Seder table, even if it's just with your immediate family and you can't have people over because of what's going on, still think about what it's like, what it might be like to be a slave. And every year we tell the story, and you think, why do we tell it every year? We already know it. Well, every year we get different understanding about the story and different understanding about what happened to the Jews and how we became the Jewish people. And so that's very important. I want to wish all of you a very good Pesach, a happy Passover, and I want to wish you all the best Passover possible, and I hope we see you soon. We miss you. Bye.